Hello, everyone. Yes, we've made it to another FISMA Friday, and I couldn't be more thrilled to spend this time with you all as we discuss how artificial intelligence is being used in the food safety process today and where this super fast evolving technology is headed. But first, since we have a lot of new folks joining us today, we're glad you're here. This is a monthly series brought to you by Safety Chain and the Acheson Group to provide regular updates, insights, and guidance to help you navigate industry shifts surrounding the Food Safety Modernization Act. And the best part is that you'll not only learn about the methodologies and tools that can help keep your customers happy and healthy, but you get to interact with our speakers to get that expert advice directly from the source. So before we dive in, just got to tick off a few notes here. First, we've muted all attendee mics, but are leaving room at the end of today's session for some Q&A. So as mentioned earlier, please send your comments and questions in at any time during the presentation, and we will do our absolute best to get through them all. But if we happen to run out of time and we didn't get your question answered, don't worry. We'll definitely follow up with you after the session. And of course, this presentation is being recorded, and everybody who registered will get the link to the replay as well as the slides later today. All right, let me welcome back to FISMA Friday. He's the James Bond of food safety, Dr. Ben Miller, whose 20 plus years experience spreads from epidemiology to food inspection to food safety regulations. And Ben is a frequent speaker even here on FISMA Friday and has discussed different ways to prevent foodborne illness outbreaks. And he also helped guide us through all of the craziness surrounding the food traceability route. So Ben, it's great to have you back with us. And this no doubt is going to be an exciting presentation, a very interesting one for folks here to noodle on over the weekend. But before we dive in, would you mind sharing a little bit more about your background?
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks, Jim. So my background is, as you mentioned, kind of an epidemiology outbreak investigation, and I had a chance to kind of oversee and lead the food inspection programs for the state of Minnesota for a while before joining TAG about 5 years ago. And since then, I've worked in just a bunch of different issues related to food safety regulation, outbreak investigation, and for a time, quite a bit in COVID too. And I'm glad that glad that we can look at that in the rearview mirror to some extent right now. But I've always had an interest too in technology and data and trying to understand, what could we do in the future as we look at, this technology progresses and matures. And I think we're kind of an inflection point right now, and we're looking at computing power and AI and some potential applications, in the space of public health and food safety. So excited to be here and talk about that with the audience today.
Awesome. Yep, me too. And I think we have a couple of FISMA updates, though, for you to share, right?
We do, yes. So let me jump to that slide, and not necessarily FISMA related per se, but regulatory updates from CFIA, so from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. They just published an updated plan on how they're going to potentially interpret Listeria mono in ready-to-eat food. So there's a link in this presentation to that, and I think if we post the video, we can put the link there as well. But they've rethought and recategorized how they're defining ready-to-eat foods, and this would become effective in October of this coming year. So for those that have kind of kept track, Canada, unlike the US, does set a limit of 100 CFU per gram for Listeria in certain types of food. And in the US, we don't have that limit. So that's been a big regulatory difference, but would invite people that, do business in Canada or maybe manufacture food north of the border to take a look at that. There's a lot there. So it's worth a look. The other thing is that the USDA earlier this week rolled out their proposed determination for salmonella and not ready-to-eat breaded stuffed chicken products. So when we think about things like chicken Kiev and those kind of stuffed products that you might find in the freezer section of a grocery store, USDA is proposing that they're going to do testing of some of the raw materials, so the raw chicken materials that are used to make those products, and actually set a threshold of 1 CFU per gram for salmonella in those products. And when we look at kind of the history around those products, there's been about 14 or 15 outbreaks in the last 20 years associated with those products. That was one of the first outbreaks actually that I worked on as an epidemiologist, was an outbreak associated with breaded chicken products. And the issue back then was labeling of those products. The industry's done quite a bit in terms of labeling to make it clear that those products aren't ready to eat, but that they're ready to cook. But we've still managed to see some outbreaks associated with sort of undercooking of those products, and that's really driven USDA to come out with this proposed determination. So right now we're in a public comment period until I think mid-June. It's a 60-day public comment period, but there's a link there to the Federal Register, which really outlines the details around that. So some regulatory updates there. And if we kind of move to the next piece, so what am I going to be covering today? I'm going to talk about AI, and just we're going to start with a little primer on AI, just because I think it helps sort of set the groundwork for understanding what some potential applications currently are or might be in the future for how we might think about using some of these tools for food safety. So with that, we can jump right in. So what is AI? I think it's good. There's a lot of different definitions out there. This one I actually pulled from IBM. They've got a pretty good site on AI and just some of the background on what we'll be talking about here in the next few slides. But in this definition, again, there are many out there, but essentially AI is a field which combines computer science and data sets to enable problem solving. So I think we've heard a lot about ChatGPT and some of these large language models that are, kind of hit in November and December of last year. And you've got OpenAI and Google and Microsoft all kind of playing in this space. And, maybe some of those on the call have actually used those tools, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But, that's one example of AI where we've fed a lot of language into these deep learning or neural networks, and what we get out is chat bots that can essentially kind of push back what seems like coherent answers to a lot of different questions, although they're not always going to be correct, and we'll dig into that a little bit more here. It does encompass the field of machine learning and deep learning, so those two things are related. Deep learning is a type of machine learning, and these algorithms are really built in a couple different ways, and we'll talk about the different ways in which, at a very high level, these algorithms are built, and sort of the strengths and weaknesses of each approach. So when we think about just different types of AI models, some of the nomenclature that's used within the field refer to weak and strong AI. So really right now we're still kind of in that what we would call weak AI space, where there's very narrow applications, or we would say somewhat narrow applications for use. So those would include things like visual identification systems, self-driving cars, these large language models like ChatGPT, some of the technology that you probably interact with on a regular basis in the form of Siri or Alexa. Those are all AI models that are developed for specific use. That would compare to something that's strong AI or artificial generalized intelligence. So that doesn't exist as of yet today. But if we kind of look at science fiction, we have some ideas of what that might look like. Those of you who have watched 2001 and remember HAL as kind of the central computer as part of the spaceship, or somebody like C3PO would be kind of generalized intelligence. So you've got a machine that's able to make decisions sort of freely based on a large problem set. So taking on much more human-like characteristics. So again, we're more in this weak AI space right now. And when we talk about kind of comparing machine learning versus deep learning, machine learning requires at a high level, generally structured data sets, and generally covers this concept of supervised learning. So that's where you've got data sets that are labeled that you can plug into, basically a machine learning algorithm, and it learns based on comparing labeled data and outcomes of labeled data. So some visual models are trained with labeled data. So, sometimes when you log into a website and you have to click on those CAPTCHA things, like click on the pictures of a bridge. Well, you're actually helping train some of these machine learning models by doing that and creating labeled data so that they can learn and visualize this is a bridge versus this is a chimney versus this is a crosswalk. So that's an example of supervised and somewhat reinforcement learning. We're not going to talk necessarily too much about that, but kind of covering two ends of the spectrum when we think about the different types of learning that are out there. And then we've got things like deep learning, and that's neural networks. And that's what we're, when we think about something like ChatGPT, these large language models, in part, those are trained on unsupervised learning. So basically you're plugging in a lot of unstructured data sets, and the neural network tries to start to identify patterns within that. That's kind of an overly simplistic description of the process. But at a very high level, that's how it works. So when we think about some of these large language models, what it's looking for is patterns. So how frequently do words occur next to each other? And there's some pretty high level math that goes on behind the scenes to basically plot the relationship of words to each other in a particular language, essentially in 3 dimensions. So there's a whole lot of computing power needed to make those associations, especially when you're crunching a huge data set like that was used to train like these ChatGPT and Google models. So I think it is useful, and there's quite a few words on this slide, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to understand the differences between supervised and unsupervised learning and sort of what those different types of data sources can be used for in terms of application. So if you're using supervised learning, really the goal is to predict outcomes, based on new data that you might see. So the type of things that you would expect to see versus unsupervised data, where the goal is to really get insights from large volumes of new data. So in that instance, for this unsupervised learning algorithms, the machine itself determines what's different or interesting in the data set. So it will draw conclusions that maybe humans never would by detecting patterns that exist in these data sets. And that does differ from supervised learning, where you would expect to figure out sort of what the outcome is. So some examples of that would be, in the case of supervised learning, like spam detection or weather forecasting. So we can put data in and we would expect to understand the outputs that we get out of these systems. And again, that differs a little bit in terms of unsupervised learning models, where you're looking for anomaly detection or recommendations, or even in the case of things like medical imaging, what are patterns that the machine is detecting that humans may not be able to as readily detect? Complexity, supervised learning is simpler, and there's a lot of, I'll use kind of air quotes around the term simple, but there are computer programs where you can look at logistic regression models and kind of measure statistics that you're feeding into that supervised learning model to figure out and how to label some of the data that's associated with those data sets. In the case of unsupervised learning, we're really working with huge data sets that can't easily be classified, and because of that, you need a ton of computing power, and that's why a lot of these large language models, for example, have been developed by Silicon Valley companies that have a huge amount of computing power that can be used to crunch big data sets. Some of the drawbacks of both is supervised learning can be time consuming from that training and labeling standpoint, like we've talked about a little bit. In the case of unsupervised learning models, the results that come out of those can be fairly inaccurate, and those models are even said to hallucinate. That's the term that's used kind of within the AI community. looking at some of the outputs that come out of those models. One of the challenges with neural networks is, in general, the results can't be explained easily. So why, a model kicks out a certain result, you can't just pop the hood and look into it and say, oh, I see where it was drawing that conclusion from. The way that these models are structured are so complex that it's very difficult sometimes to explain why certain inputs led to certain outputs. And that's a definite challenge and drawback, especially if we think about some of the decisions that we might be trying to make from a food safety standpoint. So if a model is telling you to, clean a certain piece of equipment at a certain piece of time because it's going to reduce the risk of environmental contamination, we may not be able to explain 100% why it's making that recommendation. That's just an example. So let's talk a little bit about these large language models. This little quote down in the bottom left-hand corner is actually, or sorry, right-hand corner is actually a limerick, the foodborne illness related limerick that I asked ChatGPT to come up with for this presentation. So yeah, I think it did a passable job there. And it does do things like that fairly well. Large language models like ChatGPT were trained, like we were talking about before, on supervised and reinforcement learning models. And it's really designed to predict the next word in a sentence or a sequence of words. I think it's important to know that these weren't developed as a search engine, and the training that went into creating these models is really designed to give convincing results, but not to necessarily provide accurate responses. So I think you've probably seen a fair amount, if you've been tracking this in the news, about just sort of inaccurate information that might come out of some of these large language models. ChatGPT, the free version that's available, really the training data ended for that model in September of 2021. So, it's not great at knowing what current events are. And even knowing is kind of a stretch in that case. So I think it's important when we're thinking about potential uses of these tools, especially in a professional setting, to think cautiously about how you might want to use those. So I think we get into that a little bit here. What are some of the ways that we could use these large language models for food safety? They are good, I think, at idea generation and outlining of procedures and, as a brainstorming tool. So if you say, tell me, acting as a food safety professional, what I should consider if I'm writing a policy about equipment sanitation, it's going to give you a list of things that probably are decent ideas to think of and make sure that you include in some of your procedures. It's good. I think it's a good tool to start idea generation in that context, because again, what's it doing? It's going out and looking at its training data set, which in the case of ChatGPT is a big portion of the internet. So if you took all the content that was in Wikipedia, I think that they say that it only makes up, I think, between 1% and 2% of all the training data that was used for ChatGPT. So there's a lot of information that this large language model has been trained on. And because of that, it's able to create word associations and give you some good starting ideas around some of these topics. But there's also caution that I would really kind of encourage people to use if you are going to use some of these tools. They're not designed to essentially tell the truth. They're not search engines. You're not able to, in most instances, go and see what information these large language models are referencing when they're giving you their responses. The Microsoft one that's out there does gives you some source citations, which is helpful, but it's very different from Google, where if I Google something and look at, I'm able to see where that information is coming from. Is that coming from the FDA or is it coming from the USDA? Is this a trusted source of information? You're not generally getting that out of these large language models. And because of that, you can't really trust the accuracy of the information that's coming out of it. So, if you said, help me design an environmental monitoring procedure for listeria in my food processing facility, again, it might give you a good outline of things to consider, but the accuracy of that data or some of the potential regulatory pitfalls of a particular approach that it may generate as part of its response could be completely incorrect. So it might tell you to do a lot of zone 1 food contact surface swabbing, for example. Well, I think we know what some of the hazards are associated with that. So a lot of the output from these models still need to be validated against your own professional experience or against the experience of another, or a subject matter expert in that field. So again, that's my cautionary tale in terms of how to think about using some of these tools that have become really rapidly available within the last 6 months. So what are some potential kind of future uses, or current, well, both current and future uses of AI and food safety? So there was just a paper published at the end of last month, March of 2023, by Quinn, who I think it's a good paper. It's worth reading. We've got a link to it here in the slides, and this one I think is freely available. So I'd encourage, if you have an interest in the topic, to go read the paper. It's a good summary of kind of where the current state of the field is. So you can see here, I think this is a good diagram that comes from the paper, but we've talked a little bit about unsupervised learning, supervised learning, reinforcement learning, mentioned that a little bit, but what are some potential food safety applications? So we look on the right hand of the slide. In the case of computer vision, and we'll talk about a few of the specific examples in the next few slides, but certainly foreign object detection, that comes to mind. So rather than paying somebody to stand at the end of a production line and look for product, you can certainly train visual systems based on a set of training data to be able to identify that and, take off from a quality or food safety standpoint, start to address foreign object detection. Some of the more interesting things would include pathogen detection, so using microscopy. We'll talk about that in a slide or two. In terms of natural language processing, food safety culture improvement, outbreak tracking. I think for a long time we've thought about, can we mine and look at social media posts to figure out if that might be a good outbreak detection tool, and there's some research that's been done on that and demonstrated some success there. And then in terms of analytical tools, can we use these things for horizon scanning or hazard prediction? So how do we figure out, like, let's say, what the next sort of rising chemical hazard might be in the food supply? In Europe, a couple of years ago, we had massive recalls associated with ethylene oxide. I think a lot of food companies want to say, could we have predicted that, and how would we have done that? And I think AI can play a role in thinking about what that might look like. I don't know that we're there yet in terms of really kind of sophisticated horizon scanning, but it's certainly an area of interest. This is also a slide that comes from that paper that I think just talks about other potential uses for AI. So when we think about supply chain data, are there things that we can look at that are predictive of risk within a particular supply chain? So one that immediately comes to mind is like mycotoxins within certain commodities. So if we know that commodities grown in a region and handled in a way that might increase the risk of mycotoxin formation in that product, we can plug that into some of these models and start to make predictions about certain areas that might be at higher risk. And I know some companies are looking at the use or have developed some of those models already. So for public health, we mentioned too, social media detection, trying to figure out, can we detect outbreaks based on sort of non-traditional data sources? And then for microbial data, looking at agar plates, or even looking at bacteria on product itself, can be a way for the detection of pathogens. So can we cut down the time to detection, in finished product, especially things like produce, in a reliable enough manner that we maybe don't need to go all the way to a laboratory to identify where issues might be happening. And so this was some research that's just come out, or came out of UC Davis in February of this year, looking at the use of visual neural networks to try to identify, in this case, generic E. coli. They weren't looking at pathogenic E. coli, but being able to see if they could use a visual neural network to successfully identify E. coli and differentiate it from things like salmonella directly on lettuce leaves. So they were trying to create a screening tool that could get to that endpoint within about 3 hours, and that's obviously going to be a lot quicker than some of the even more rapid lab methods that are available currently. FDA has been using AI in their imported seafood pilot for a couple of years, and I think right now there is, as of August 2022, they're kind of in their third phase of this pilot project where they're using machine learning to predict high-risk shrimp shipments, so those that would have been treated with like aquaculture drugs, and that's based on data from importer inspections, sampling that they've done, third-party audits that are specific to shrimp. So they're plugging a lot of that data into this machine learning algorithm to try to identify higher risk shipments as they come into the U.S. Another example that's been talked about publicly is this Western Growers Association project. So they are working with Creme Global, who's a technology provider, looking at inspection data, product and water testing data, location data, and some meteorological data to try to predict where there may be food safety issues associated with produce, especially commodities like romaine in California and Arizona. So that's a voluntary program, but again, a lot of these models require a lot of data to start to get to the point where we can start to make predictive or hazard-based associations. And so that's an effort to create a large data set for the produce industry. And another paper that came out, this one's from last year, but I think is interesting and I think speaks to kind of future applications of AI and specifically food safety. And that's looking at behavioral data from the workforce as a potential leading indicator for food safety. So we often think about what are some direct things that we can measure related to food safety, and that might include data that you get from microbial testing or monitoring in a processing environment, temperature data, things like that. But there are also indirect data that we can look at. So things like hand washing, food handling practices, traffic flow, and then even things like training performance, turnover data, tenure of your workforce, sanitation verification results, and observed or self-reported behavior. So you can imagine collecting a lot of these data points and being able to feed it into one of these AI models that then can start to identify patterns that could be behaviorally based, that could suggest that some of your food safety management systems may be under stress or and could contribute to potential kind of regulatory or product safety issues. So this is not something that I'm aware of that's really kind of in practice right now, but it tells us about some places that we could be headed, and some of this can be augmented with, let's say, actual sort of visual component as well. So, can you have, or could you create systems that could essentially monitor for compliance around hand washing or even safe handling practices on a line where people are coming into direct contact with food, and look at the percentage of time that people are handling food correctly or incorrectly, and use that to essentially drive corrective actions. That could be retraining essentially in the moment, or a notification that you're out of sort of compliance from an acceptable level from a hand washing standpoint. So these are areas that may not be in common practice right now, but certainly I think suggestive of where we might be headed, especially as cost comes down for some of these systems. And finally, as we end, I think it's good to think about what are some of the challenges that we have right now. Food safety data, unlike production data, I think has tended to lag in terms of digitization. So a lot of food safety data that we have today still is hard copy data. So think about your critical control points or your preventive controls. Most of that documentation is still done on paper and signed off on by paper in most companies. There isn't a lot in the way of data standardization. So if company A is collecting data one way and company B is collecting data another way, how comparable are those data sets, even if they're sort of measuring the same thing. Without data standardization, we sort of lose an opportunity to create kind of a larger training data set that could help all companies essentially get enough background information to train some of these AI models. Another challenge is that there's just low speed and high cost of data collection. So think about your environmental monitoring data, for example. It takes a lot of time, money, effort to go out and collect swabs within a facility, and you're creating hundreds, sometimes thousands of data points over the course of a year, which may be enough to train some of these models, but some of these models to get to the point of being really accurate are going to need tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of data points. Then there certainly remain concerns about data sharing, especially between industry and the regulatory agencies. So there is work, or there are some thought models out there on ways to de-identify data, and also create essentially what are called federated learning models, where you're able to share the relevant portions of data anonymously to train some of these models. So that's a bit of a way that we might be able to approach some of the data standardization challenges that are out there right now. The other kind of final thing to think about is that AI is a tool, but right now and even in the future, we may have tools that really can answer questions better than trying to create a complex AI solution. So things like classical statistical models for determining appropriate sample size, for example, and just even kind of expert analysis may still be better options as of today and even in the midterm than some of the information that we get out of these AI models. I think I didn't mention it in any of these slides, but interpretability, or we talked a little bit about it, of just the results that come out of especially some of the neural network models. Again, we might have inputs that we're putting in, and we're getting outputs or recommendations from these models, but if it's not interpretable, if we don't understand how the model is getting to or recommending a particular outcome or conclusion, should we trust that? And if we don't understand sort of the underlying decision making that's part of that process, and when we're talking about food safety that can have significant health impacts, then I think that's an important question that both the food safety and food industry is going to have to think about, but also the AI community as well. So I will leave it at that. We're at about 35 minutes after the hour, and I think we have a chance to open it up for some questions.
I absolutely love that you used ChatGPT to create a limerick. That cracks me up. That was awesome, Ben. Thank you so much. Obviously, we're just getting started with AI, and I think there's probably a lot of folks here on this session that have used tools like ChatGPT, like you said earlier. I guess bottom line, I wouldn't trust ChatGPT to help me draft my food safety plan. What should folks think about in terms of using the existing language learning models for helping to create a better food safety culture?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question. I think where you're trying to find technical answers, or say answers to regulatory problems or scientific problems, like that's not a space that I would be comfortable using these models today. If you're trying to start and say, does my policy or procedure, or am I thinking about sort of all the topics that might fall under, particular area that I should be considering, I think it's a good tool for that. And I think similarly, we've heard the same thing, out of kind of, concerns around plagiarism and academic dishonesty and things like that. I think teachers have been struggling with this since it came out in November, December of last year. As a student, you can go and plug in, say, write me a paper on topic X, and make it 3 pages long and turn that in. But I think educators that have embraced it in the classroom, maybe in a more healthy way, have said, let's use this as a tool to help us think about all the things that we would want to think about in outlining around a particular topic. So, and I think that holds for other industries as well. So again, I think it's important to know that these are not truth machines, and that's certainly not how they've been designed. They're word association machines at the end of the day. Even though some of these large language models can perform, really well on standardized tests. But again, if I feed a lot of standardized test data into these models, it's not surprising that they're able to sort of spit back responses that make sense, because again, it's all about sort of ordering of language. So it's a bit of a mixed answer. And I think there actually is a place for these tools, in the profession, in our professional food safety setting. And at the same time, we have to be cautious in terms of interpreting results as something that I would use to make, a food safety determination. That still is at this point, luckily for us, kind of relies on our professional experience and judgment. So
Hmm.
it's a great
Yeah.
question, and I think it's just something people need to pay attention to, and I think need to really understand how these tools are built and what they do. Again, they're not search engines, and I wouldn't use them that way.
So validation, right? Always, yeah, you can start there to help you kind of build the outline, as you said, and then you should probably get some experts who understand this stuff to validate the next steps for that plan that you're building. Um, you gave some really good examples, like training AI to detect foreign objects or real-time detection of foodborne outbreaks. That sounds kind of complicated to stand up. So, are there any steps that you can recommend for companies to take to stand up something like detecting foreign objects?
Yeah, I think there are certainly technologies providers out there thinking about how to commercialize that in this space right now, but a lot of it comes down to, the data that you're starting with. So I think that's a common refrain that, you probably heard through this presentation and that we continue to hear in terms of, is how could I use AI within my company? So, think about the data that you have, in data that you might want depending on the particular problem that you're trying to solve. Again, if we go back to the beginning, all of these are essentially weak AI solutions, right? They're sort of narrow AI models to solve a particular problem. That said, they can certainly be useful. So, I think it behooves people to think about, how do I collect data in a structured and ordered way so that at some point in the future, if I want to then, stand up or contemplate an AI solution, that I could do that because I've collected data in a way that would allow me to do so. And so the case of, visual differentiation, that may not be something that you would immediately do, but in terms of sort of record management, are there ways to think about structured data and that I'm capturing things in a way that I could use to train a future model, even if I don't necessarily know what the problem is that I'm trying to solve today, by having data that you can build and train these models on, you start to be able to sort of open up opportunities in the future.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to what you ended the session here with is, you don't necessarily have access to all the data in the world. You have access to your data, and you might have access to some public data, but ultimately there's going to be a little bit of bias, right? As you're looking at some of these analysis or what have you that the AI is generating for you, because it's just looking at your particular situation and not necessarily taking into account other environmental factors.
Right. Yeah. Unless we figure out as an industry, and I think we'll see this over the coming years, but ways to potentially share in a sort of anonymous or de-identified way relevant food safety information. We often talk about, food safety is not shouldn't be a competitive advantage, and at the same time, obviously companies have concerns about sharing, confidential information. So again, I think that's an area where we're going to see
Right.
work, is how do we learn from each other in a way that sort of benefits everybody, but also, protects people's individual information as well.
Yeah. This is a really loaded question here. How do you know when you have collected enough data to have an AI solution actually work to your benefit instead of harm you? Meaning, if an AI isn't trained properly, it's not going to give you any significant results.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think a lot of it, it gets to a concept that most kind of QA food safety people are familiar with, and that's one of validation, right? So, in the case of the UC Davis research that they were doing in terms of visual differentiation around E. coli on lettuce leaves, their model was, I think, about 90% accurate in terms of being able to differentiate, and then we have to say, is 90% good enough? If we're talking about sort of pathogen detection, what's the threshold that we would be comfortable with? Is that 90, 95, 99, 99.9, and so, you're able to improve essentially the accuracy of these models the more data that you put into them, and so some of it's defining that threshold of success and sort of how good is good enough.
Yeah, and again, it kind of ties back to expected outcomes. So you're training the model, and I know you kind of talked about this as being sort of supervised learning. You're training the model so that you can expect what types of outputs it would give you, and you can validate that more quickly than maybe with unsupervised learning, where it's just going through all kinds of unstructured data and it's spitting things out. It thinks it's important, but you're not entirely clear why it's doing that. Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
let me ask about this because you brought this up, and I know you said there, to your knowledge, there isn't really some use cases around this yet, but it kind of makes sense, right? Behavior data, so hand washing or scrubbing or that sort of thing. Um, this kind of might sound scary to some to think, geez, every time I wash my hands, this is getting calculated by some artificial intelligence. Is there any risk, do you think, in terms of, we'll just call it personal protections?
Yeah, no, I think that it's a great question. And I think that's something that needs to be considered as part of these systems overall, right? So do I want to measure sort of the totality of behaviors that might create food safety risk, but how do I do that in a way that doesn't personally identify somebody or that couldn't be used in a way that's punitive,
Correct.
And
Yeah.
I think those are the reality is the technology could be used in a way that was you know that might be punitive, and I think it's incumbent on both those that design these solutions and those that deploy them to think about what am I truly trying to accomplish, and do I want to create an environment where people feel like they're under surveillance, or do I want to create an environment where that data is not immediately identifiable, but it's useful because I'm able to detect when behaviors might be happening that could affect food safety. So much is dependent on the way that we both design and use the information coming out of these systems. And I think the challenge right now for the field overall is that there aren't a lot of rules or guidelines or regulations in terms of how these systems can be used.
Hmm.
And that's not unique to food safety, but I mean that's unique to the whole field itself. Even in so much as I'm sure you've probably heard in the news, there's over 1,000 kind of AI researchers were signing an open letter saying we should pause, these large language model development for 6 months and figure out what's really going on here. So
Hmm.
powerful tools, but ones that can generate unintended consequences as well.
Yeah, it's a little bit of the Wild West right now, but obviously I think people are getting turned on to the fact that it does need some regulation, and then obviously the technology itself is evolving so quickly that there's this concern of, and you mentioned this with universities trying to stop plagiarism. There's just this concern where you don't know where there's a human and an artificial intelligence. The lines are just so blurred. It's pretty crazy. All right, so Giselle asked a question around, could AI be used to detect allergens?
That's a great question. I think they could, in terms of, I'd have to think about, kind of what data sources you would be able to regularly or quickly feed into a system, in order to do that. The short answer is probably, although I'm not an expert in necessarily kind of allergen chemistry or some of the tools that you could use for rapid identification in those instances. But I think those are the kind of questions that are worthy of explanation or sort of exploration, and it does get us to thinking about what are some non-traditional data sources that you could use for early detection of these things. So it's good that people are thinking along those lines, because I think those are the kind of questions that we want to dig into.
Right. If I'm a food safety manager and this sounds like a good idea, and yes, we're just at the very tip of this iceberg, but where do I get started? Help me along the lines of identifying potential use cases for artificial intelligence in its current form, and then how do I get started building an AI program that would actually work for those use cases? So there's a lot in between those two steps, but if I'm a food safety manager, this sounds like some pretty heavy stuff. Where do I get started?
Yeah, I think get started by kind of writing down sort of what are some of the issues that you struggle with, in terms of what would be some problems that I would want to solve kind of internal to my own operations. And then, once you've sort of defined some of the problems, then I think, it's thinking about what data do I have around that currently? Do I have enough data that would sort of be able to support me answering some of these questions? And then, I think it's reaching out to, people that your current technology providers, are they contemplating an AI solution? It's reaching out to others within your professional network. It's reaching out to folks like us at Tag to say, do you have contacts within the industry that might be able to help me start to think about applications for this? It's such a fast maturing field, as you mentioned, that we're going to see technology providers that haven't traditionally been in the food safety space entering, and those that have, thinking about developing use cases and solutions based on the data that they're collecting and supporting. So but for me, a lot of it comes to what's the problem that I need to solve, and really getting a good definition of that in
Mhm.
place.
Yeah, and
Both.
and yes, to your point, you got to have the data. You could
Yep.
have an AI, but it's not doing anything for you if you haven't taught it something. So you really start need to digitizing your records, your trend analysis, all of that stuff. If you're able to digitize it, that's just going to benefit you once you actually are able to stand up an AI solution. It's good. Okay, I think we are at the end of our questions for now, so I think it's time for us to share the more resources page, which means, hey, look at that. It's the food traceability rule guide that you helped us build, Ben. There's so many great resources you can check out around FSMA, compliance, anything that essentially you need to do to build a better food safety culture. You can check out the Acheson group at achesongroup.com or Safety Chain at safetychain.com to learn more about how to better your food safety game. So I want to thank everybody. Thank you, Ben. I hope you all enjoyed this presentation and you walk into an amazing weekend ahead. Hope to see you at next FSMA Friday, everybody. Take care.